All right, good afternoon, everyone. I have the honor of introducing Chris Huff, who will deliver our keynote speech this evening, or I'm sorry, this afternoon. I just wanted to, again, reiterate what I said earlier. Chris Huff is a visionary, and I've been so delighted to be able to work with him here at the Center for Racial and Disability Justice. I know Jordan and I have been really blessed, I'll say, to have his insights, his knowledge, his enthusiasm, and his passion for this work. So I want to introduce him and allow him to share some words with us this afternoon. Chris Huff is an impacted person of color with multiple disabilities. Chris leads local, state, and national diversion and reentry public policy efforts at Access Living, a Chicago-based service and advocacy nonprofit organization for people with disabilities. In this role, Chris centers people of color and people of color with disabilities impacted by the criminal legal system. Chris will be in this role until Tuesday. Following that date, he will launch his own business, and I'm excited to hear more about that. Chris led citywide community organizing efforts at Heartland Alliance, READI, Ready Chicago, an organization focusing primarily on reducing gun violence through cognitive behavioral interventions, employment, and wraparound social services for high-risk individuals. In addition to community organizing, Chris helped lead student civic engagement at the University of Chicago's University Community Service Center, and was responsible for designing social justice-based cohort programs for undergraduate and graduate students at the university. Through his work at the Vera Institute of Justice, Chris also led formerly incarcerated youth in developing policy and program recommendations for the Illinois Department of Juvenile Justice. Finally, Chris worked at the University of Chicago Institute of Politics, where he advised University of Chicago students on ways to use their educational experiences to promote civic engagement on Chicago's South Side. Chris has served on the boards of Chicago Votes, a nonprofit organization committed to empowering young people and engaging them in the political process. He has also served on the board of the Cook County Detention Center, where he supported efforts to eliminate solitary confinement. Chris currently serves as a member of the Illinois Justice Project's Illinois Reentry Council and served on the Illinois Department of Human Services, Department of Mental Health, CESA, the Community Emergency Support Services Act, statewide advisory committee. Chris also serves as a member of the City of Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson 2023 Public Safety Transition Team, organized the 2023 Global Social Impact Accessible Public Safety Conference, which we're all privileged to be a part of, in partnership, of course, with the Northwestern Pritzker School of Law, Center for Racial Disability Justice, and the Lawndale Christian Legal Center. Chris has also partnered with the Cook County Sheriff Tom Dart to initiate the process to create the first ever Office of Disability in the Cook County Sheriff's Office, and advised on the improvement of their intake and officer training processes to improve disability services and support. Chris has a bachelor's degree in political communication and economic development from Oglethorpe University and a master's in social work from the University of Chicago, Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice. Chris is also a University of Pennsylvania Graduate School of Education, Grad Prep Academy Scholar. Additionally, he has received a certificate in urban leadership from Oglethorpe University, Rich Foundation Urban Leadership Program, and a certificate in public policy analysis from the London School of Economics and Political Science. I hope you see why we are so grateful to have Chris here giving our keynote. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Chris Huff.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Jamila. So I'm gonna do a kind of keynote that's probably not as traditional because me being here is not as traditional. So in many respects, this like I guess you can call it a speech is really like I guess a better way to describe it is a live acknowledgement of the people that supported me and helped me get to where I am today. And so the title of this is called Y'all Act, I Believe. Y'all Act, I Believe. And the goal of this is to provide formal acknowledgement and appreciation for the family history, the neighborhood and community experiences, and other key relationship experiences that shaped my life progression that made today possible. And there's two core objectives that I want to accomplish as a result of this speech. One is to examine the importance of positive relationships, support systems, and resources that it took from facing essentially life in prison at the 15 years old and being charged as an adult to a 33-year-old man here today, and to helping advance global disability health supports for impacted people of color. And the second is very important, because to like get to this space and get to this level, like you inherently just understand the importance of innovation in our current system and the need to begin to tackle these issues in a different way that can actually kind of from an evidence-based standpoint, move us closer to a more healthy community and make it more, I guess you say, support systems more readily available. So the second objective is to encourage more research at the intersection of neuroscience and public safety to help improve behavior, belief development, relationship development, and positive social network development for impacted people, to help us better be able to build our own systems, develop our own networks that are self-sustainable, while simultaneously being able to better engage with networks and systems and communities outside our own. And there's some key inputs that go into the sort of listed acknowledgements that I want, you all to consider as you like listen to these names and listen to these people who kind of like served as like key resources to help me get here today. And one input is conversation. We truly underestimate the power and influence of conversation. The sort of basic nature of asking a question, wanting to learn about someone else's history, wanting to learn about somebody else's background, and the transformative thing that can do to the brain to rewire neural pathways and restructure our sort of neural networks so that we feel more connected, more loved, more supported in our lives. The second is the importance of memories, the memories that come with those conversations and how they kind of shape our belief system. The third is the positive feedback loops that are necessary in those conversations to help reaffirm and connect ourselves and help us develop a sense of hope rather than a sense of despair. The fourth piece, like input that goes into these sort of people and connections and relationships, so to speak, is the idea of practice. Because when you go from one social system to another social system, when you go from one economic system to another economic system, you're not always gonna know the words, the phrases, the concepts, the behavior patterns that are necessary to inform your successful engagement in that network, and you have to be willing to practice and I think we really don't understand how practice can really inform the neural activity in our brain and shape the way we are able to more effectively engage with one another. And the fifth piece, the input that I feel like we often miss when we talk about, success in this world. Like there was a professor, her name is going to come up again at the University of Chicago when I was at Crown Family School. She was, leader of this network called the Network for College Success. And they had did a research, if I remember correctly, looking at, success in Chicago public schools. And what they found was success wasn't primarily determined by technical skills, how well you write, how well you are able to edit an email or a essay. But your success was more likely to be determined by non-cognitive factors, such as your level of resilience, your level of grit, your level of perseverance as you're enduring the dysfunction and chaos in the Chicago public school system. So last piece that I want to do before I kind of go into these names to kind of help serve and create this sort of context of the power of these connections is like, what is the outcome I hope to gain as y'all listen to my words right now, as you kind of experience this sort of space at the 2023 Accessible Public Safety, conference, right? One is the importance of learning how to use pain and difficulty as motivators rather than barriers. Not using this sort of idea of something being hard and something being difficult as like a reason to not engage, right? I'm afraid, so I'm not going to engage. But I think it was, Nelson Mandela said, courage is not the absence of fear, it's the ability to take action despite fear. Key component to this list of names and experiences, right? The second outcome I hope that you all gain as a result of, experiencing, the sort of list of acknowledgements and this kind of conference experience that has been, created, by Access Living, by Lawndale Christian Legal Center, by Northwestern Law School, Pritzker School of, Racial and Disability Justice, is the importance of helping other people with helping train other people with lived experience. I mean, how to use their expertise that is developed through lived experience that I'm trying to display right now. The importance of using that and helping them develop it in a way in which it doesn't take a rare story like mine to have this experience right now. The third piece is around this sort of idea of importance of helping each one of us learning to develop the skills necessary to lean into not just the development of external resources, the acquisition of jobs, the acquisition of healthcare, the acquisition of, actual, what do you want to say, housing, but also learning the importance of developing internal skills that help shape what goes on in your brain, right? So like soft skills, like critical thinking, social emotional skills, right? These other sort of kind of innate skills that are required to successfully engage throughout our society that we don't often put enough emphasis on. And the last piece that is like crucial in terms of an outcome that I hope to acquire from like this list of acknowledgement is an increased understanding of the importance of centering informal and formal relationships that you experience in your life and not just centering yourself. Like I really want to do that and so with that said, I want to do a disclaimer because these are, my memories. not theirs, because what a lot of people don't understand about mental and behavioral health disabilities and mental health crises is when we go through a crisis, we create a crisis for those around us. And when that happens, we not just increase the likelihood, like we're not just traumatized. In many respects, often other folks are traumatized around us. And this is a very important piece to this puzzle of everything that I'm about to say, is because when we experience crisis, it not only disrupts the way we view ourselves, but the way people around us view us. So that very relationship building that I talk about, support system, network development that I'm talking about, that helps support the sort of neural activity and the neural development that goes on in the brain that shapes beliefs and shapes, behavioral skills and shapes all these things. It's a good chance that we not only become afraid of ourselves, but people become afraid of us. So what happens is they don't want to engage with us. And and we're afraid to engage with ourselves. And we actually need the interpersonal connection to help us develop the beliefs and develop the faith in ourselves that people still love us. Because one of the core things I learned in, treatment programs, and, I'm blessed to have experienced some of the best and also some of the worst, but a common denominator is what they call core beliefs, which is this idea that I am not good enough. I am not deserving of love. So when you have a core belief that I am undeserving of love, or I am not good enough, and the people around you are, you become invisible or disconnected from the people around you who gave you positive feedback loops, but since you went through a crisis, you are no longer connectable. I don't know, I might have made that word, but you no longer are someone that they want to connect with because you are quote unquote crazy or psychotic, displaying behavior that they don't understand. And since they don't understand it and feel like they don't have the skills to work with it, that, you lose connection, and there goes your support system. The very thing, a core piece to the thing that you need to develop your internal system and your access to external resources. And so I just want to give that disclaimer that this is my memory, not theirs. So some of these folks I name on the list might not, either A, remember me, even remember the experience, but I do, and it's huge. And honestly, some of these people are dead, so they can't hear anyway. But anyway, so the first one who is no longer here is my grandfather, who was a principal, and, a graduate of, Loyola University, in graduate school, and was a principal at a time when being a Black male and a principal was a thing. And having and being a neighborhood, a community, organizer, and working in the community to help support the community was a very important role. And he was a medic in, and I believe it was World War II. The second is my mom, who was a teacher for Chicago Public Schools, and an administrator, ironically in the Office of Specialized Services, helping, evaluate and train and support special ed, practitioners. The third is, another, I wouldn't even call it ironic. It's just, it's just, the beautifulness of life, is now she, works at the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs, providing crisis support for veterans going through crisis on the phone all night long. She works the night shift. The fourth is my sister, who is oh gosh, she's my second mom, who I wouldn't be here without her after going through a crisis and, losing access to housing here in Chicago. She gave me a place to stay in Florida. Talk about social, the importance of networks. The sixth is my father, Reginald Huff, who is also no longer here with us, who died at 17 years old. Died when I was 17 years old, who was diagnosed with, manic depression, who, I went on to be diagnosed with bipolar disorder and PTSD and, other things. And my surrogate father, Irvin, who was the first, disciplinarian in my life, who taught me the importance of learning from my consequences. He would always whenever he disciplined me, he would first sit me down and he would say this is gonna hurt me more than it hurts you, but I have to essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but teach you that it's consequences for not doing, it's consequences for the display of, for not doing what, you need to do. And so I'm going to move on to my neighborhood because I will not be here. That's my family. I think the next core kind of network and folks, a lot of these folks are dead as well. Half of them died before I was 17 years old, before I was 18 years old. First is my best friend, Brenton Huff. We got the same last name, but that was just happenstance. We didn't know of any internal family connection that connected us, but his name was Brenton Huff. He was a protector and mentor. He was the first person that taught me the great old American creed that we don't talk about enough, but it's huge in America, which is it's not what you know, but who you know that can shape your social outcomes and economic success in life. The second is my best friend, Tony, the only one of us in that kind of core group of 4 or 5 that was who, came to my house every day, is Tony Sutton, who is a survivor of neighborhood violence and a barber now as well. My best friend, Darius Cantor, and Darius is very important because Darius, who is no longer with us, was shot multiple times in a case of mistaken identity while driving through a neighborhood, and he got a bullet stuck in his spinal cord. So I decided to travel up from Georgia because I was in high school at the time, because something told me spiritually that I needed to connect with him. Just got shot, need to get to him, get to it. So that's what I did. I got on the road, got to him. I get to the hospital room, it's dark outside. I mean, not dark outside, it's dark in the room because he got the blinds closed, and I walk in and his eyes lit up. And I'm like, why are you sitting in the dark? What you doing? So we sit down, we get to talking, and in the middle of the conversation, before I even get to the middle of the conversation, we get to talking about the neighborhood and the idea of him not wanting people to retaliate, right? The importance of not retaliating and the destruction that retaliation would do to the community that he did not want to come from his, gun violence experience. And so we got to talking. I'm very solutions oriented. So what do we need to do? And then he got to talking and telling his story and about the community services and the support services in the community being disconnected. Nobody know what each other is doing. And we get to talking about, all of these issues and what they were causing and all of that stuff. And in the middle of the conversation, he says, press the red button. I'm like, press the red button? What you talking about? I'm like, and then he gets to shaking, and then I get up and I run to the room. Run to the side of the bed. Oh, red button. I get deposited. And when I tell you this moment felt like eternity, it had to been less than 30 seconds, but it felt like forever. I run inside the hallway because I felt nobody was coming in. I ran into the hallway to wave the nurses and the doctors down, something is going on in here. Something is going on in here. Y'all need to come. And a bunch of doctors rush in the room, bunch of hospital folk, nurses rush in the room. And next thing I know, they push me out of the room you got to go to the waiting area. So now I got to call his mama. I got to call his auntie. I'm letting them know there's something going on. And some hours later, that day, maybe a few, he's pronounced dead. And I'm going to fast forward real quick because I think this is very important. What I learned from that moment, what would become the basis of my University of Chicago Brown family school experience, or what I would become to call the importance of community integration, which is essentially the essence that accessible public safety is built on. The idea of integrated services, integrated supports that are necessary to provide better supports for people with disabilities. And that's like crucial. The next piece is around, next is Anthony Licey, motivator, competitor, Tony, who we call Skeet, which was Troy Taylor, who was a mentor and community advocate. Gran, this is another. Gran is Darius's grandmother. And this moment is me and Gran's connection is the essence of the purpose of that term purpose that I listed out earlier. Because at Darius's funeral in a church on the south side of Chicago, she dies in the front row at the funeral. And I remember walking to the front of the church, to the front row, and seeing her dead body on the ground, and the emotional reaction of seeing her dead body feet away from her dead grandson elicited an emotional reaction that caused me to just walk out of the church. And I remember thinking to myself and walking to the curb, staring down the street, something's got to be done about this. Something has to be done about this, the violence, the destruction. And I went on a pursuit to that day to understand what I needed to learn, what I needed to do to produce a more just, humane society. And if I couldn't help do it, then at least die trying. And the next is Kobe, who was killed in a robbery, if I'm not mistaken, armed robbery. Victim of gun, a motivator and inspirer. I remember when he leave my house, because he sometimes he would struggle with a stable place to live. And one time he stayed at my house for some weeks, and we just grew a deep bond. And there's many others from my neighborhood that the list is too long to list, but those are the first ones that came to mind when I wrote this. And there's just a few other areas, and it's really all school related. First, amongst the schools, without a doubt, is Northwestern Law School, Children and Bloom Legal Clinic, Children and Family Justice Center, because they're the ones who, when my mom couldn't afford an attorney because of the ridiculous cost in this country for legal support and services that we felt like would be adequate to fight a case of my magnitude, they decided to take it up. And it was two lawyers that will forever be a positive influence on my life. I remember my first day in adult court, because I was charged as an adult, and I remember walking through the bullpen and older men grabbing their peanuts, licking out their tongue, banging on the window, looking at me like I was a piece of meat. Keep in mind, I'm 15 years old in an adult court in Cook County jail. And I was terrified. And I'm supposed to go from that experience to the courtroom, and like the person said, someone said in the first session, I'm supposed to be emotionally calm and stable once I walk inside that courtroom. So I got to find a way to take all of those experiences and threats of what comes along with those images. I don't have to repeat. And I remember I feel like this is really weird. And I remember thinking about this at my Northwestern at the Penn State Law School conference I spoke at. My therapist in many ways was my first therapist. Cause I remember learning how to calm down from anxiety from my moments in the bullpen, and she was trying to prepare me to go to court as I was freaking out, internally, and it was her support, saying we're going to do our best, or giving off the feeling of we're going to do our best. We're going to do this, we're going to fight. And it was that notion, that support that caused me to be okay, let me do my best to go inside this courtroom so I can do the appropriate behavior. And the other piece is, Julie Beal, the current director. Like, I remember like in my 20s were my hardest years, because I didn't really develop the symptoms until like mid-20. Like, I had got diagnosed when I was 15, but I didn't really experience the psychosis at an intense level until my mid to late 20s. And I remember her like she can tell, like I was trying to put on a front like I wasn't experiencing psychosis, and like she clearly knew probably I was experiencing psychosis, and she's like take your medicine, like take care of your health, and like providing this sort of social support, which I clearly couldn't like digest at that moment in time, but those seeds that were planted definitely took root by the time my early 30s came. And so many other people at like Northwestern Law, at the Children and Family Justice, there's just too many to count that like. So the next is like University of Chicago, The first is like my first like staff supervisor post undergrad when I was working at the Institute of Politics, Dylan Siegler, like that's how I got access to my first formal treatment program as an adult. And like started learning the basic skills and the knowledge that I'm able to share today about treatment and about how it affects the brain and all these things that kind of, once again, that lived experience, like lived expertise through lived experience. If you go through the programs, you kind of know what they teaching because they teaching you. So like there's an expertise that comes as a result of just going through the experience of like proper treatment, of effective treatment. And next is Amy Chan, who like, words don't describe like the lessons and because she was so good at like leading by example. She had this like model, like for it's, I think she'd probably kill me if I didn't remember this correctly, but I'm gonna do my best. It was scaffold, model, coach, fade. Scaffolding was presenting the information and the sort of information that is needed to like kind of understand it. And then the next was modeling what you was teaching. And then as you modeled it, you get coached through the process. And then the fading, like with all great leadership, you should be able to fade away from that process once the person you're teaching reaches the level of preparedness that they are. Come on, man. How many people get access to like that level of like, like this is rare, man. The next is David Axelrod. The founder of the IOP. I remember the first time I met him. I had just met the Supreme Court Justice, Sonia Sotomayor, like that week. And I was asked to write a reflection on my experience meeting the first Latino Supreme Court Justice in United States history. And I wrote a reflection, and her book, because she was at the Harold Washington Library, I remember reading her book. Listen to her talk about her book, and she kind of in many ways talked about her insecurities that she experienced, which I connected to imposter syndrome that I experienced being a Black man with disabilities at the University of Chicago. And I kind of wrote a very short piece on it. And the first time I remember crossing paths, he was like, oh, I read your reflection. That was really good. And I was like, oh my God, he knows who I am. Like, he read my, ooh. And the next thing he told me was I sent it to the Supreme Court Justice herself. And I was like, whoa. And like, there's so many other ways, but like, I'm bringing that one out because that's the first interaction I remember. And that was powerful because that memory reaffirmed my writing skills, which my current supervisor probably can attest to aren't really the best, especially when it comes to emails. But to affirm my writing skills and my abilities to write in a way in which like they connect with so much that you do something like that was very reaffirming. And the other is Xavier Ramey, you know, him, you know, serving as a reference for me to get this job, him talking to me as a colleague when I was working at the IOP and he was working at the UCSC. And as two Black men coming together, like, you know, supporting each other, like helping, like provide positive feedback loops. Then the last, you know, 3 areas before I wrap up is Oglethorpe. You know, rest in peace, you know, because last time I heard he might have passed away, is Dr. Hetherington, my economics professor. Then I'll be remiss if I didn't mention my political advisor who helped me create and approve the creation of my own degree, what they call at Oglethorpe, an individually planned major that integrated. Y'all see that integration going way back? Integrating political science, economics, urban leadership, and communications to create a degree that will prepare me for a career in teaching and community organizing. Then my friends, like I'll be remiss, some of them, I'm not gonna be able to list everybody, but Dr. Jen Riley, who was the one that told me I even had that option. Chad, who probably from that experience is the closest person I'm still with today. And, you know, and there's others. And then there's a few more. And like, I'm getting to a space where like, I'm about to go into Black men. And like these ones that I'm about to name, like are like, I cannot underestimate the importance of connecting with people who like kind of, you know, like as a Black man connecting with other Black men are like, it's an important thing. And having positive connections is even more important, like is like crucial. So I got accepted to the University of Pennsylvania Grad Prep Academy my junior year of college to prepare me for a career and to get me a PhD straight out of college. And it was run by a professor by the name of Dr. Sean Harper, who, you know, is a phenomenal like professor and leader. And he created this Black male, like sort of, you know, almost like a peer respite within itself, like a collective learning experience itself. And Dr. Anthony Johnson, you know, who was, you know, a mentor I acquired from the program, who worked with me. I mean, how many times that man like forced me to rewrite my grad school essay for the University of Chicago? Man, I was pissed off. I'm like, man, like, dude, we must have did about 40 edits. And I'm like, but it worked. I got a full tuition scholarship. You know, the lesson was learned. Like, you want something, you got to work for it. Like, and you can't be afraid to like revise, practice, do it again. And the last one from the communities, because those are all different communities, is Operation Hope. John Hope Bryan gave me my first leadership, my national leadership opportunity. He made me the director of the Office of Small Business and Entrepreneurship at Operation Hope at 22 years old. He saw something in me that I didn't, it was mind blowing. Like, you want me to lead a national initiative? I am 22. Okay, sure, let's do it. And it was an entrepreneurship training program called Business in a Box, helping elementary and, you know, elementary school students and, you know, young people develop businesses, you know, that from a box. Take out some ideas, learn how to develop, you know, the sort of knowledge, the resources that's in those boxes, and, you know, and like do business. And now here I am, my next, you know, job out of here is in entrepreneurship. I don't think that's a coincidence. And, you know, James J. Bailey, I'll never forget, he may not remember this, or, you know, my memory is I got really excited one day because, you know, keep in mind, I'm 22 and I'm running this national program. So I have no idea, like, really what I'm doing, but I'm trying. And I had developed like some sort of graph or chart that like projected something. And I just thought it was phenomenal. And in his like real cool, calm way, he was like, And I thought it was great. And he's like, greatness is your starting point. Greatness is the starting point. And I was like, huh? And I had never heard a positive affirmation ever like that from another Black man, like in that way. And it just reinforced certain things. And the other is Walter Jackson, the father of my best friend, Chris Jackson, in college, who was the one who facilitated the connection to Operation Hope in the first place. Once again, the importance of access to resources and opportunity through relationships. And believe it or not, Senator Warnock, who did one of the prayers for the breakfast, because he at the time, worked, I experienced him like do prayer for some of the like breakfasts that we did. And he came in one day and did the prayer breakfast. And then when I saw him run for senator, it just did something to me, like to remember that experience as a 22-year-old young man, and see him like go from there to there. It was powerful. And there's a few, there's two others, and these are the last two, I promise. People. This is outside organizations and communities, because these two people I have never met a day in my life, but they arguably collectively together have had more influence and more power in a way that I approach the world than arguably maybe, equally as much as all those other people together have called. One is Barack Obama. I'll never forget the day he won Iowa, because up until that point, I didn't believe he could. And he won Iowa. And I was like, this is like a 90-something% white state. Like, and he won, like, what? He might be able to do this for real. And I remember he walks out and like gives, the infamous speech. And I'm seeing the yes, we can, change we can believe in, banners waving. And I was like, that. Like, I want to connect with people like that. And I remember studying his videos, reading his book, Dreams of My Father, The Audacity of Hope, watching his speeches. And then the other one is Jay-Z. Because, if like the first interpersonal therapy I experienced was was a bullpen, trying to de-escalate my like emotional experience, it was music is my first form of like, overall therapy. And that's because it was before I knew what musical therapy was, where I used music to help regulate my emotions. I used music to help motivate me, to help like get me through difficult times. And Jay-Z did that for me. And two of those people, like, I just want to underscore like why they are important, because both of them have a sort of calm and a sort of use of language and communication skill with that calm. Like, I have never seen either one of those people just all over the place. Like, they're very calm. And they both have a very great use of words and they like kind of like, in a way, like form them and merge them to like inspire people and connect with people and move them. But one just does it over a beat and the other does it, on a campaign tour in front of a podium, just freestyle, what we call a rapper freestyle, like no beat at all. And with that said, I'm going to conclude with there's 5 key lessons from my journey that I want to impart as I conclude, that I believe are essential, like just essential elements that I believe it took to go from that extreme, that neighborhood extreme, to this here. Is first, the importance of me having to learn how to quote unquote be clear. What does that mean? I had to learn how to articulate my feelings in a very detailed way. And since my emotions are very complex, that requires a very effective use of different words, because my emotions and my experience are so deep, that in order to learn how to articulate my emotions, I would first have to learn how to feel them. The second is learning the importance of laying things out, because verbal communication isn't the only form of communication. Nonverbal communication, body language, other things. But in particularly, as I moved up in my career, like professionally and academically, the importance of articulating my feelings in writing, learning how to write was one of the most instrumental tools in being able to navigate the destruction and structural violence and institutional oppression of this country. The third was learning to understand the difference between cost and value versus how much something costs, but how much is something actually worth. And with that respect, learning to understand, like, not letting others define my value, but learning that that responsibility in many respects, like, ends with me. And like, I'd have to know my value and like not be letting nobody else define the value for me, which leads me to number 2 is like the importance of being conscious, aware of what's around you. When you go through all those different systems, those different communities, those neighborhoods, these different levels, like you got to learn that you got to be conscious. Like you got to identify the word patterns. You got to identify the sort of behavioral patterns. You got to identify the structures and systems that allow those behaviors to like maintain themselves. And like, you got to recognize that everyone is like, won't like you, not gonna like you. And sometimes they will like act like they do, but they really will just do it to use you. And that's why you got to understand, you know, your surroundings. And the last piece, which is like almost like to me is the most, like not almost, it is the most important, because, and it really relates to the integration of those first 4 concepts, which is learning to be vulnerable. Like not being afraid to share your challenges in moments of crisis or moments leading up to crisis or just in general. Because like learning that it's power in that vulnerability, shout out to Brene Brown, learning that there's power in that vulnerability and it is not a weakness. And with that said, I want to say thank you everyone for coming here today, for sharing this space. Like this isn't truly like, you know, a touching and like moving experience for me. And I hope it is for you as well. So thank you. It's an honor to have to share.